Hello, my friends. In this video, we're going to learn something very important about how we make discoveries, how we learn how the world works. We are in the 21st century, and science, evidence-based methods are critically important for figuring out how the world works. So suppose you're interested in the field of genetics. You want to know if certain genes contribute to certain things. So suppose you're interested in something very controversial like astrology, and you want to know, how does astrology work? Does it work? Are there actual real relationships between what goes on in the sky and people's behavior? Lots of us have strong opinions about this, but how do we determine these things in a modern world? How do we know? How can we figure this out? Well, the totally awesome thing is that new insights, new methods, new ways to figure out how the world works are being developed all the time. And in the last 10 to 20 years especially, there's a new research method. Well, it's not new. It's been around for a long time, but it's been revived and implemented and utilized in new ways. It's very exciting. It's called extreme case sampling. I'm going to show you how extreme case sampling is making breakthroughs, new discoveries, new insights in genetics, and how in astrology the scenario is almost identical. Same kinds of problems, same kinds of issues, extraordinarily similar conceptually. And how extreme case sampling, boom, opens up doors to figure out how things work. So a lot of people think that research is, you have a hypothesis, you collect data, you have a control group, you do these statistical analysis. That is one kind of research. There are so many methods, so many clever ways to figure out how the world works. And when you hear about extreme case sampling, it doesn't sound as rigorous. It does not sound as, as powerful. It doesn't sound as good as some other kinds of research methods. That's because extreme case sampling historically was used in the social sciences, in situations like case studies, things like that. But now extreme case sampling has emerged as a vitally important technique for making new discoveries. A lot of people trained in various areas of research methods are not familiar with the whole range of research methods that go on in different disciplines. Nobody's familiar with all of it, including myself. So this may come as a surprise, even to people who are trained scientists, data scientists, social scientists. What's happening here? So I want to share this with you because if you're interested in understanding how the world works and you want to engage in research, or you just want to appreciate what people are doing in the sciences, this is exciting that there's this new development. Now, this does involve research methods and a little bit of discussion of probability and things like that. Not the most exciting thing in the world for a lot of people, but I think this really is important and interesting and vitally important for people interested in making progress in understanding areas like genetics, astrology, and many other areas. Okay, I'm going to build this up from the ground up. Number one, why do we do research? We do research to learn more about how the world works. We strive to gain greater confidence in the relationship between things. The goal of research is not to prove something or to be 100% of what is true. So some people will say, oh, the idea of research is to be completely scientific and know something. Well, we don't know anything with 100% confidence. The idea is to get more and more confidence in understanding what's going on in the world, how things are related to each other. And as I mentioned, there are many, many, many research methods to improve our understanding of how the world works. And as I mentioned, one research method that has become more popular in the 21st century in some particular fields, and I think it's going to be utilized in additional fields in the future, is extreme case sampling. And as I mentioned, we're going to look at genetics and astrology as two areas where extreme case sampling opens doors. Things that you could not find before, you can find using this research method. Or to say that more accurately, you could find them using other research methods at 10 times, 20 times, 100 times the cost. So if you think, oh, if I spend the next 30 years researching something, I can find this out and invest a lot of money as well into doing that. Or maybe I can do it in 6 months to a year. Whoa. So in certain situations, the extreme case sampling speeds up your ability to make discoveries, makes it feasible. If you don't have support from large research institutes and get grants and so on, that you can't even begin to do those more expensive, complicated procedures. And even if you can, of course, we want to be as efficient as we can possibly be. So, why is extreme case sampling emerging as an important research method? Well, to appreciate that, let's see what the alternatives are. And let's look at it first in the field of genetics, because it's in the field of genetics where extreme case sampling has emerged and shown itself to be extremely powerful and important. And then we'll see that the principles for why extreme case sampling works so well in genetics can apply to other fields. And we'll use astrology as an example of that. So, what kinds of research methods are used in genetics? Well, there are a lot. Two of them are genome-wide association studies. Well, that's a mouthful. Genome-wide association studies. It's actually a fairly simple idea. I will explain what it is, and we'll refer to it by its common abbreviation, GWAS. The emerging new method that's also being used is extreme phenotype sampling. This is extreme case sampling applied to what's called the phenotype. I think you know what a phenotype is. There's a genotype and a phenotype. Genotype means your genes, your DNA. That, you know the classic idea that there's a gene for eye color, something like that. So what's the phenotype? It's simply the expression, your eye color, brown, green, blue, whatever your eye color is. So phenotype is a fancy word for just meaning the physical characteristic or behavior, whatever it is, the expression of the gene. So extreme phenotype sampling means in the research, the researchers select extreme people. They've done research on obesity, for example, and they have a measure, it's a kind of a crude measure, but good enough. I mean, not crude, but it's not perfect, that measures obesity. It's called the body mass index, BMI, and it's the amount of fat relative to, no, it's just the weight and height. So, it's not a perfect measure, but you don't need a perfect measure. So it's a ratio of weight to height, and it's easy to calculate. It's available with large populations. You take the few percent, 1, 2, 3, 4% of the people with the highest BMI, the highest scores on obesity, and you research only them. Whoa. It sounds like trickery. I don't have to study all the people, all the data that I've collected. If I've collected body mass index for, by the way, I hope I defined that correctly. Doesn't matter, whatever the BMI measures. If I have the BMI, the height and weight or whatever is needed for 10,000 people, I don't actually need to look at all 10,000 people, and yet I can learn something from that, but I need this may sound weird. I'm going to collect the data for 10,000 people, but I'm only going to analyze the top 2%. So I need the 10,000 just so I can select the top 2% or 1%. Some bit at the top. And what they do in that study, they also take the bottom 1%, the least, to make sure that what they discover with the extreme obesity does not apply to the least obese. And just confirm a few things. But primarily it's just to focus on the extreme cases for whatever you want. It's like cheating because we're told that, to do research, you have to collect the data, analyze all the data. No, there are certain situations where you don't. And it works beautifully. And I'm going to show you quotes from peer-reviewed research articles in prestigious journals where they say that this extreme phenotype sampling, in some cases, gives just as good results as studying all of the data at tremendously higher cost. So this is the breakthrough. And it's a breakthrough in the field of astrology. People have strong opinions about astrology. How can we determine it? People determine if there's any actual tangible effects from astrology. Some astrologers say, well, it's not tangible. Okay, but can we answer the question? Here's an example of tangible. Is Virgo picky? Is it fussy? Is Libra accommodating? Is Scorpio intense? Does Sagittarius like to travel? Is Capricorn businesslike? Is Aquarius, whatever you think Aquarius is, different idea. Is Pisces mystical? What? Are these true? Well, using extreme case sampling, you can get insights into this and get some answers at much, much, much less time and energy. Now, it's easy for me to say. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how it works in genetics, what they've discovered, and why this is so powerful. Okay, well, let's look at the alternative a little bit more to the extreme phenotype sampling study in the case of genetics. We're going to look at this genetics research in a little bit of detail so that I can show that this is real, that this extreme case sampling stuff, it's real, man. It really, really is working. And that has been confirmed and validated and developed, especially in the last 20 years or so. Excuse me. Let me quote from this article here. It was updated in January 2024 at genome.gov. A GWAS, so this is one of the standard research procedures used in genetics, is a research approach used to identify genomic, you can just, for our purposes, just think of it as genetic. Genomic means the whole gene sequence. We don't need to get too detailed about the genetics here, but for our purposes, you can just think of it as your genes. The genomic variances means people have, the genes vary. Identify genomic variants that are statistically associated with a risk for a disease or a particular trait. Yeah, like if you want to know what are there genes that incline to, for example, the research on obesity. They've done research on schizophrenia, on bipolar disorder, on all kinds of things. Are there genes associated with it? You want to know. Okay. Very similar to astrology. Are there planetary positions associated with being fussy, picky, proud, etc.? Or certain behaviors, athletic ability, musical ability, whatever. How do we find out? Okay, well, the GWAS using genetics involves surveying the genomes of many people looking for genomic variants that occur more frequently in those with a specific disease or trait compared to those without the disease or trait. So it's very simple and straightforward. And when they say many people, they mean many. Like in a lot of these GWAS studies, there's hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions. Okay, so what you're doing is out of those million people, for example, let's say you have a million people and you have the genetic information on all million of them, it's a straightforward association thing. You pick out from those million people the people that have diabetes, who are schizophrenic, whatever, and you see if they have genes in common that are different from everybody else. You might think this is going to be fairly straightforward, but oh my God, it gets crazy complicated and very difficult because of the way genes work, which is not so simple and straightforward. This happens to be very similar, almost an identical situation in other fields. And we're going to use astrology. And don't worry if you think astrology is baloney. If you think it's nonsense, it's okay. Doesn't matter what you think of astrology. But it shows it's another good example of a field very similar to genetics conceptually in terms of the problems faced. Okay, so you might think this is pretty straightforward, but it gets complicated, and I'll explain why it gets complicated. Once such genomic variants are identified, they are typically used to search for nearby variants that contribute directly to the disease or trait. Well, here's part of the complication, is that the genes come in these packages, and so sometimes you identify, you might say, the package, and you have to find out which gene within that package of genes is actually responsible. So narrowing it down is a little tricky. The goal of genome-wide association studies is to screen the entire genome of large numbers of individuals to look for associations between millions of genetic variants within those individuals and their disease outcomes, or sometimes for associations between the variants and the non-disease traits such as height. This is like looking for a needle in a haystack. You've got thousands of genes, huge number of people that are going to do the entire genome, the cost of this is huge. You have to get a very thorough genetic analysis of all of you need a huge number of people for this to show anything significant. So this is tremendously expensive, very time consuming and expensive. You have to collect all this data. You can see why the extreme case sampling is so attractive. It just eliminates huge amounts of the work and still gives very useful results. The first GWAS was published in 2005, and after that, the study approach just took off exponentially. So I said, this is a development in the 21st century. It's the reason why a lot of people are not familiar with it. If you're not involved in genetics research, why would you know about this? So this is a new development in a particular field where, we haven't even gotten to the extreme case sampling, which develops even later. So these are developments in genetics. And also, why 2005? Well, it was in 2003 that 92%, roughly over 90% of the human genome was sequenced. Big technological breakthrough in sequencing the entire genome, the entire sequence of genes in a human being. By 2022, they reached virtually 100%. So with that information, this kind of research could really be done. So genetics is really taking off with all of this data and information. So GWS tests hundreds or thousands of genetic variants across many genomes to find those statistically associated with a specific trait or disease. GWS aims to identify associations of genotypes with phenotypes by testing for differences in the allele, I hope I'm saying this word right, allele frequency of genetic variants between individuals who are ancestrally similar but differ phenotypically. Well, what this is saying is if you have siblings in a family, and one sibling has one trait and the others don't, what's different in the genes of this person that might account for the difference in the trait that this individual has. More than 5,700 genome-wide association studies have now been conducted for more than 3,300 traits, and a push for more statistical power has thrust GWAS sample sizes well beyond 1 million participants. Wow. Huge amount of investment. Because it's important. We want to know what the genes are doing. I mean, if a discovery is made about a gene that's inclining towards an illness like diabetes or mental illness or whatever, wow, can you put a price on that, the value of that? So enormous amounts of it. These are massive studies. So conclusion, a GWS is a massive and therefore expensive study. I mean, massive and expensive is relative, but, relative to, you and me, it requires, university or research institute, high level, integrated work by many data scientists and geneticists to work through it. It's a major undertaking. Now, some of the challenges. Previous GWASs have shown that most now this is where it gets really, really complicated. And in some of the research articles I read, they explain how they didn't anticipate, some of the researchers didn't anticipate how complicated this would get. So here are some of the complications that get involved. Because you have a simple idea, why do we need to do extreme case sampling? Why don't we just take 1 million people, sequence it, see what the people have in common? Well, it's just not that straightforward for many reasons. Most traits are influenced by thousands of causal variants that individually confer very little risk, are often associated with many other traits that are correlated with causal and non-causal variants that are physically close as a result of linkage disequilibrium, making direct biological causal inferences complicated. Okay, let me break that down a little bit. Something like, even things like height. It's not 1 or 2 genes that are contributing to your height. Hundreds, thousands. You take something like an illness, propensity to a mental illness or physical illness. Thousands of genes. And you know how much each gene contributes to a tendency to be schizophrenic, bipolar, whatever. Those are studies that have been done. And genes that contribute to the potential to be schizophrenic or bipolar have been found. But what we call the effect size is very, very small. They contribute to bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, whatever was studied, just a tiny bit. So a little bit of information. Well, a little bit's better than nothing. But after all this huge amounts of time, energy, money put into it, a little bit of progress has been made. A little bit. And one of the reasons is that each gene that contributes to, say, bipolar disorder contributes almost nothing. Almost nothing to the bipolar disorder. You take hundreds or sometimes over 1,000 different, I'll just call them genes. There's more technical and better terms for these things. But the genes, you have to collect it. The cumulative effect of 1,000 genes before you get even a small measurable effect. How crazy is that? So this is very, very, very hard to detect. These subtle, almost invisible little contributions by each gene, but if you get the right bunch of them together, you will see an effect. And then the genes are connected with other genes in completely different places in the genetic sequence. It's like, so it's a strange bunch of correlations between genes. It's called linkage disequilibrium, LD, which means that when one gene occurs, another gene or a paired gene will also occur in a completely different place. So not all the genes that seem unrelated are just random. So there's just complex interactions among the genes. This all makes it really difficult to disentangle what's going on and figure out which genes are actually contributing to this. So this is the reality of how things work. Genetic associations may differ across ancestries, complicating direct comparisons between groups of individuals. Some of these limitations hamper drawing unambiguous conclusions about the biological meaning of GWAS results, sometimes limiting their utility to produce mechanistic insights or to serve as starting points for drug development. I think you can follow that. It's very difficult to get mechanistic insights. Like, even when you learn basic genetics and you learn that, oh, there's a gene that contributes to eye color and it can be, a dominant gene or a recessive gene. It sounds very mechanical, very straightforward. But where genetics is now is very complicated, very intricate. Things are just not so simple and mechanistic. It's difficult to come up with clear results. If you're interested in questions like, does astrology work? Well, what if astrology works similar to genetics? And you have astrologers walking around saying, oh, well, you're a Taurus, so you like chocolate and money. What if it's intricate, like genetics? You would never find anything. So as the sciences advance and the social sciences and the evidence-based fields like medicine, psychology, as they advance and they get into these complexities, and they will encounter them similar to what's found in genetics, then it's not so easy to figure out what's going on. And as time goes on, one of the studies I read shows how these GWAS studies are producing weaker and weaker effect sizes over time, because as we learn more, we're getting into the greater complexity and interactivity of what we're studying. And all of these problems and issues and complexities are addressed very often in a better way. Obviously, it's not a panacea, it doesn't solve everything, by the extreme case sampling study. So what research procedure works best depends on what you're studying. If you're studying something with very small effects, and possibly a combination of many of them, we call effect sizes. Each gene contributes very little, and you need a lot of them to get any kind of noticeable, measurable result. You're dealing with very, very, very small effect sizes. This is one of the cases where extreme case sampling is extremely important. Now, in the field of astrology, in the year 2022, I think it was, I can't remember, very recently, about a year and a half ago, I published this book, The Astrology of Bipolar Disorder, a Scientific Breakthrough. And part of the breakthrough is that there are many variables, many astrological variables, that have a simple and consistent foundation to them, that when you bring all of these variants, like you have a basic concept, like certain vibrational effects, like an 11 vibration with certain planets, and there are many, many, many variants. I mean, this sounds just like genetics. So many different ways it can combine. But the underlying principle is simple. That may be simpler than the genetics, where they're just genes all over the place. But in this astrological research, we're finding a consistent conceptual theme with so many variations of it. Like it can be an 11, 22, 44, 88, 176. They're doubling of these things, the way the planets interact. Many variants, but we can put all of that into a formula and evaluate it. And that's exactly what they're doing in genetics. They're taking all of these genes, combining them together, and then weighting them. One gene contributes more to bipolar disorder than another gene. So you weight it more. They're called weighted. We do exactly the same thing in this new evidence-based astrology field. The parallels, the similarities are striking. It's like identical. So this is what we're doing, is finding out that you can use extreme case sampling when you have many variables and each one has a very, very small effect size. That's a perfect case for extreme case sampling. You also have to have a lot of data. There's a lot of data in genetics. There's a lot of data in astrology. Some software programs have 50, 60, 70, 80,000 charts. There's data available. So same scenario, we have the data. We can build these formulas, these combinations of things. And by picking out the extreme cases, we can see what's going on. So I'm going to stop this video soon, and we're going to pick up with a part 2 and make this a series of videos. But let me just say a couple more things before I end this first video in this series of videos. This is a disappointing conclusion about GWAS. The record of GWAS in driving the discovery of biological causes of phenotypes has, however, in general been disappointing. So, peer-reviewed, very sophisticated journal article published in 2020. It's disappointing. Does that mean we're going to give up on GWAS? No, because we, the human family, we need to know. I mean, we will benefit tremendously if we know the genetic triggers for behaviors and conditions. It's going to help enormously. So we've got to use what we have. But fortunately, I've got this on the slide here at the bottom. Fortunately, a GWAS is not the only possible research design. There's also the extreme phenotype sampling research design. It's an alternative that's simpler and less expensive than the GWAS, and in some situations produces results, information about what genes are related to certain behaviors, physical traits, etc., that's comparable to a GWAS. So, the extreme phenotype sampling, the extreme case sampling has proven, has shown to be extremely important in genetics research. It's really, really helped dramatically. In the case of some other fields like astrology, it's even more important because you don't have the funding, you don't have universities, you don't have grants, you don't have teams of trained professionals working on it. You have a handful of people on their own. You don't have the resources to go to do these more complex things. And extreme case sampling works beautifully. Okay, point is, people hear about extreme case sampling, they think, well, I don't hear much about that. Is that really important? Oh, yeah, it's important, making a huge difference in the field of genetics. I've actually had correspondence with some of the researchers writing these articles on extreme phenotype sampling, methods used, and I told them what I'm doing. They said yes. And I just wanted to confirm and discuss it, with you might say colleagues, with people who also have greater expertise in this. And they said yes. Everything you're saying should work perfectly. Everything you're saying makes perfect sense. Okay, let's stop here, and the perfect place to stop. In the second video in this series, we're going to talk more about exactly what extreme phenotype sampling is. Okay, thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.